obligations this holiday season, or as you're starting to interact more with the world and we're all starting to open back up and there's more social gatherings happening and definitely more travel and things like that, you really do want to remind yourself of what your boundaries are. And sometimes that means when you're interacting with that friend that you've set the boundary, like, hey, don't call me when you're drunk. I just don't want to hear it. We can talk about your problems, or we can try to, I can be a listening ear when, I can understand you and you're sober and like there's some kind of cognizance happening there, right? Like just remind yourself of what those boundaries are. When it comes to work, reminding yourself that like I take my breaks. I get up and physically leave my desk and take my breaks. I take my lunches. You have to remind yourself of these habits, these boundaries that you already have. And with your health, it's remembering that boundary of like, no, I'm not going to stay up late tonight and do this thing that I wasn't planning on doing because I have my workout in the morning, and honoring that boundary by just reminding yourself like that is my boundary. And when it comes to your spiritual self, just reminding yourself that you do need that check-in. You do need to honor that boundary of like connectivity to whatever spirituality or to whatever, nurtures your soul internally. Number 2, you want to speak them out loud. You want to communicate your boundaries. This is so important. After you have a boundary and you've put it in place, like you've said to yourself, like, no, I'm not going to work extra hours to get an emergency project done that wasn't planned for or that could have been planned for. Like if it's a true emergency and like absolutely there was no way anyone could have foreseen this happening, a meteor strikes and you got to rush to figure out how to deflect it or whatever. Sure, that's an emergency, but these like one-off things that it just somebody didn't plan well and now it's become an emergency to you, you have to remember to tell the person and to speak out loud and to communicate like, look, I don't work after hours on emergencies that could have been foreseen. Or, telling your friend when they're sober and you're having that conversation, like, I can't talk to drunk you. Like, drunk you is annoying and I don't want to talk to them. And communicating that boundary. It's so important, especially for those of our listeners out there who are people pleasers and who are caught in that trap of being so afraid of conflict and so adverse to facing someone else's disappointment. And I know that goes back to like a lot of people have a lot of, at their core, some challenges with disappointing other people and how that really can trigger some depression and anxiety and people will avoid conflict at all costs because there's such an uncertainty there and there's so much judgment and shame. But you really have to speak your boundaries out loud to people to give them the opportunity to know, like, hey, you're getting close to the line. You've got to be able to say what it is you've created. You've got to communicate that. Number 3, you've got to enforce these boundaries. So what that means is you have to start becoming the kind of like the bouncer at the bar for yourself. You have to be the one who's like, absolutely not. We do not put up with that kind of horse shit. And now you're going to be removed, said person who is, violating the boundaries. Because when you empower yourself, and you empower yourself as far as setting a boundary in any of these areas that we talked about, again, like work, family, health, friends, and spiritually or soul. When you've done the work to figure out the boundary you need to set and you've put them in place, you've told people where they are, now you have to actually enforce them. And how you do that, it's actually pretty simple. You just become a parrot and you repeat it over and over and over again. This is my boundary. This happens when you cross it. And again, if you're new and you didn't get a chance to go back and listen to how you set boundaries, maybe that's where you start. You start with, what is the boundary? This is my boundary. And this is what happens when you cross my boundary. And just having that in place. So the next time you deal with this person or you deal with the situation where you need to set boundaries, you've got an enforcement plan ready to go. Because if you've constantly been the kind of person who has no boundaries, who lets people walk all over them, who teaches other people like, yeah, you can ask me for anything and I will stop what I'm doing, rearrange my entire life, and do whatever you need done because that's what feels good to me, because being a savior feels good to me. Once somebody learns that, they're going to continue to act as if that's the case. And you're going to have to be the one to stand in the way and say, no more. Sometimes that looks like communicating to them like, hey, this is no longer acceptable behavior. And sometimes that looks like conflict. And I know that that is like what everyone's trying to avoid. But some kinds of conflict are healthy. They're healthy for growth. So I encourage you to start determining how you're going to enforce these boundaries that you've set, especially as we start getting into the holiday season and you're starting to interact with family. I saw a really funny TikTok the other day of this LGBTQ guy walks into the foyer of a house and it says something about, my family doesn't know I know this life hack, and he's carrying like a thing of cookies. He comes in and one of the family members is like, oh, I see you brought cookies. Like, I hope you saved some for us because it looks like you gained a little weight. And then another family member is like, oh, you're not going to bring up all that LGBTQ stuff, are you? And then the person just covers the cookies back up, turns around, walks out of the house. Like, they didn't know I knew this hack. And I'm sharing this with you because as enforcement, leaving a situation that is uncomfortable for you, even if it's your family, even if you've traveled hundreds of miles, that is you enforcing your boundary. And while it is scary in the moment, there is so much great reward. You begin to teach yourself that you have your own back. And that is integral to boundary setting. Number 4, another way that you can honor your boundaries for self-care is you'll want to evaluate them. You're going to want to look at your boundaries and understand the boundaries that you've set and look at them and see, are they changing with you? Are they serving you the same way they did when you set them up? So my example from a few years back, I had a friend who would call me always drunk, like, oh my God, the world sucks. And it would be so draining. And after talking to them, like barely understanding them, half the time they would never remember they called me or that we talked for 2 hours. And the other times when they would remember, they wouldn't really apply what I had offered or what I had, given them as advice or whatnot. And they were just repeating themselves over and over again. So the first boundary was like, hey, don't call me when you're drunk. I don't want to listen to you when you're slobbery and I can't understand you and you don't even remember it anyway. Like, I'm here for you. I'm your friend. I will listen to whatever bullshit drama you got going on. And if you want me to just listen, I'm down for that. If you want me to help problem solve, I'll put some energy and effort into it, but no more calling me drunk. So then after a few years and, that boundary had to get enforced and it was challenging. There were some definite conflict moments, but then I had to reevaluate that and really think about it. Like, where did that boundary come from? Well, it came from a need to not be drained uselessly. And when you start to identify what created the boundary in the first place, you can really start to evaluate whether or not a different boundary is needed, like removing that person from your life completely. Because if they're a drain on you when you're interacting in this one way, and you're starting to see, well, actually, that's kind of across the board the same, then you can really start to determine, do I need to change that boundary and make it a more broad boundary, a more sweeping boundary, and just cut them out completely. So you really want to evaluate your boundaries and really think about like what created them in the first place and are they serving you? And last but not least, number 5, a way to honor your boundary for self-care is to execute the boundary. So when I talked about enforcing them, right, that's like you state the boundary, like don't call me when you're drunk. Enforcing it is hanging up on them every time they call if they're shitty wasted. And executing the boundary is then going back after the call and saying, hey, you called me when you were drunk last night, and I told you I don't like that. Giving them that reinforcement. If you do it again, I'm gonna have to cut you off, man. Like, we can't be friends anymore because this is a pattern and there's no resolution. And while that's a really simple, easy example, right? There's a clear good reason to identify and execute and evaluate that boundary. It's not always that easy in all the other areas of your life, like work, right? Like you have a job, you get a paycheck, they have an expectation of you, and sometimes you're not able to meet the expectation for whatever reason for outside factors, but you still have to have that boundary in place. And sometimes that can feel like, well, I don't want to lose my job by standing up, and I don't want to be an assertive asshole. But the truth is, and I've known this from personal experience, whether it's your professional life, your home life, your romantic situations, or even the way you work internally, every single time you do this practice and you honor your boundary and you stand up for yourself, you reinforce the truth that you are there for yourself, that you love yourself, that you do care for yourself, and that taking care of yourself is a priority. And no matter how uncomfortable it might be, you're willing to do the uncomfortable thing because it is good for you in the end. And I'll just say this as I wrap up today. The benefit of holding true to your boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you're experiencing consequences, is that there is a certainty and assuredness. When you say to yourself, no more, I'm drawing the line. I'm saying, no, this behavior is not acceptable. When you do that and you stick to it, even when it's uncomfortable, something happens, something shifts inside you to where the people-pleasing and the codependency and the lifelong doormat position that you've held all of a sudden seems super absurd to you. And the light bulb goes off and you start to realize, hey, I'm a worthy person and not everyone gets access to me. And if you want to ride the bus, you got to be on the bus. You got to be for the bus. You got to follow the rules. You know what I mean? And it's so empowering. It builds such great confidence. And it helps you to feel good and better about making self-care the priority. Because as you build that confidence, as you set the boundary, you execute it, you stick true to it no matter how uncomfortable it is, there's always that moment of super satisfaction that you did what was right for you, no matter what. And that's what I really want people to take away from today's episode, is that when you set a boundary for yourself and you say this kind of behavior is not acceptable anymore, and you stick with it even if there's uncomfortable consequences, you will find yourself in a much happier, more fulfilled, more secure lifestyle. All of a sudden, there's all this relief and all of this time to take care of yourself and to focus on you and to focus on what you need to get done, to feel accomplished, to feel good, to reach those goals that you've really been wanting and that maybe you've just been putting on the sidelines because there seems like there's so much more that needs to get done for others. And I want to remind you, self-care is about putting yourself first. This is not a practice of pedicures and massages. This is about how do you change the way you think about yourself and your placement and importance and worth. And that's what boundary setting and honoring boundaries can really do. It will project you further and farther faster than any other act of self-care that you can do right now. Because yes, a pedicure makes you feel good about yourself. It makes you feel taken care of. But honoring your boundaries makes you feel like a fucking boss. It makes you feel like you're in charge of your life. And I want that for you. I want that for you because it is so sexy. It is the best feeling ever. Like nobody can push you down. Nobody can talk shit and nobody can change the way that you feel about yourself because you're developing it for you internally and no one can touch that. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. That's it for this week. If you have a story you'd like to share and want to be on the show, please email me. It's Chris, Kris, at selfcareissexy.com. Okay, we've got some really great content coming your way, including a holiday travel episode. So if you've got some travel coming up and you need to figure out how to infuse some self-care, I got you covered. And remember that self-care is sexy. We're giving you permission